Welcome back. This is episode 4, and today we're diving into the next chapter. Let's get started. Chapter 4, Intrauterine Bonding. Several years ago, I came across a report by a Swiss pediatrician named Sternemann that was remarkable. The more so because his subject, the sleeping patterns of newborns, wasn't new. Medical libraries are full of reports on neonate sleeping habits. But Dr. Sternemann had added an ingenious twist to his study. Instead of beginning at birth and looking for explanations as other investigators had, he had moved back one step to the womb. That imaginative shift produced a dramatic difference. His results showed there is a simple reason why newborns sleep when they do, and it has nothing to do with feeding schedules, nursery routines, or anything else that happens after birth. A child's sleeping patterns are set months before in utero by his mother. In his study, Dr. Sternemann demonstrated this fact with exemplary simplicity. He chose two groups of pregnant women with different sleeping habits, early risers and late nighters, then studied their infants' sleeping schedules after birth. As he suspected, all the early risers bore early rising babies. All the late-to-bed mothers had late-to-bed children. This near-perfect example of bonding before birth, and that's the only phrase that accurately describes it, is what excited me so much about the study. By simply taking that one step backward, Dr. Sternemann was able to show that unborn children can adjust their rhythms to their mothers with as much precision as newborn babies can. Of course, we already know how crucial bonding is for newborns. Babies who synchronize with their mothers often benefit. Still, this synchronizing is complex. And the fact that so many mothers and babies are able to carry it out flawlessly on the first try has always intrigued me. Recent evidence suggests that some of the mother's responses are biologically regulated. But even with that advantage, how could a mother and unborn child perform such an elaborate and perfectly timed dance without the benefit of rehearsal beforehand? Dr. Sternemann's study showed that months before birth, mother and child were already beginning to mesh their rhythms and responses to each other. This pointed squarely to one conclusion. Bonding after birth, which had always been studied as a singular and isolated phenomenon, was actually the continuation of a bonding process that began long before in the womb. The eminent Harvard pediatrician T. Barry Brazelton had suggested as much previously. Speaking at a symposium on bonding, he had hypothesized that mothers and children who meshed immediately at birth might be drawing on a communication system established earlier in pregnancy. This theory was largely borne out a few years later by a discovery made by a biologist at the City University of New York. Although their findings came from animal, not human research, the intrauterine communication system they discovered between mother hen and unborn chick worked pretty much the way Dr. Brazelton suggested such a system would operate in people. It was built around a series of elaborate and quite specific cues, and it aided in post-birth adaptation, just as he thought it would. The investigators found that chicks which had been hatched by their mothers were much more responsive to their new environment than those who had been incubated in a mechanical brooder. It is fair to assume that if such a system operates in an animal fairly far down the evolutionary scale, a similar, though much more advanced system operates in us. Several new human studies support this conclusion. In fact, what emerges from all these new reports is a picture of a human intrauterine bonding system, at least as complex, graded, and subtle as the bonding that occurs after birth. Indeed, they are part of the same vital continuum. What happens after birth is an elaboration of and depends on what happened prior to it. This realization explains the source of the newborn's surprisingly accomplished post-birth performance. His ability to respond to his mother's hugs, stroking, looks, and other cues is based on his long acquaintance with her prior to birth. After all, sensing his mother's body and eye language is not very challenging to a creature who has honed his cue reading skills in utero on the far more difficult task of learning to respond to her mind. The reports of Drs. Lukesh and Rotman have demonstrated his awesome powers in this area. An even more impressive example of maternal-unborn communication came in a paper delivered by a highly respected Austrian obstetrician named Emil Reinhold at a recent meeting of the International Society of Prenatal Psychology. While its subject was fetal reaction to maternal emotion, It also demonstrated how the unborn becomes an active participant in intrauterine bonding. Like Dr. Sternemann's report, this one was disarmingly simple in design. Pregnant women were asked to lie prone for 20 to 30 minutes on a table under an ultrasound machine. What Dr. Reinold deliberately did not tell them was that when a woman lies like this, her child eventually quiets down and lies still too. As each child relaxed, his mother was only told that the ultrasound screen showed her baby wasn't moving. The terror that information produced was expected and deliberate. Dr. Reinold wanted to see how quickly a mother's fear registered on her child and how he reacted when it did. In every case, the response was swift. Seconds after each woman learned her child was lying motionless, the image on the ultrasound screen began stirring. None of the babies were in any imminent danger, but as soon as they sensed their mother's distress, they began kicking mightily. Very likely, part of their reaction was due to the rise in maternal adrenaline levels produced by Dr. Reinold's frightening announcement, but only part. On another level, these children were also reacting sympathetically to their mother's distress. A child whom I'll call Christina provides an even more graphic example of intrauterine bonding. I learned about her from Dr. Peter Feder-Freiberg, a boyhood friend of mine who is now a professor of obstetrics and gynecology at the University of Uppsala in Sweden and one of Europe's leading obstetricians. Everything had begun fine, Peter said. At birth, Christina was robust and healthy. Then something strange happened. Bonding babies invariably move toward the maternal breast, but inexplicably, Christina didn't. Each time her mother's breast was offered, she turned her head away. At first, Peter thought she might be ill, but when Christina devoured a bottle of formula milk in the nursery later, he decided her reaction was a temporary aberration. It wasn't. The next day, when Christina was brought to her mother's room, she refused her breast again. The same thing happened for several days thereafter. Concerned, but also curious, Peter devised a clever experiment. He told another patient of his about Christina's baffling behavior, and that woman agreed to try breastfeeding the child. When a sleepy Christina was placed in her arms by a nurse, instead of spurning the woman's breast as she had her mother's, Christina grasped it and began sucking for all she was worth. Surprised by her reaction, Peter visited with Christina's mother the next day and told her what had happened. "Why do you suppose the child reacted that way?" he asked. The woman said she didn't know. "Was there an illness during her pregnancy, perhaps?" he suggested. "No, none," she replied. Peter then asked, point blank, "Well, did you want to get pregnant then?" The woman looked up at him and said, "No, I didn't. I wanted an abortion. My husband wanted the child. That's why I had her." That was news to Peter, but obviously not to Christina. She had been painfully aware of her mother's rejection for a long time. She refused to bond with her mother after birth because her mother had refused to bond with her before it. Christina had been shut out emotionally in the womb, and now, though barely 4 days old, she was determined to protect herself from her mother in any way she could. In time, if Christina's mother changes her attitude, she will probably be able to win her affection back. But that affection would already have been established if they bonded before Christina was born. They may differ in time and circumstances, but the effects of intra- and extrauterine bonding are nearly always the same. Just as the emotional patterns established immediately after birth are long-term and often decisive in shaping the mother-child relationship, so too are those before birth. The two also share specific time frames, the best period for extrauterine bonding being the hours and days immediately after birth. For intrauterine bonding, the last 3 months of pregnancy, and especially the last 2, by which time the child is mature enough physically and intellectually to send and receive fairly sophisticated messages. The mother's role in both is also similar. She sets the pace, provides the cues, and molds her child's responses, but only if he decides her requests make sense to him. Even a 3 or 4-month-old unborn baby will not follow his mother lemming-like. If her moves are confusing, contradictory, careless, or hostile, he may ignore or become confused by them. In short, intrauterine bonding does not happen automatically. Love for the child and understanding of one's own feelings are needed to make it work. When these are present, They can more than offset the emotional disturbances we are all prone to in our daily lives. The unborn child is an amazingly resilient being who can make even a little maternal emotion stretch a long way if he has to, but he cannot bond alone. If his mother shuts down emotionally, he is at a loss. That is why major psychotic illnesses such as schizophrenia usually make bonding impossible, and also one reason why the offspring of schizophrenic mothers have such a high rate of emotional and physical problems. An external tragedy sometimes has the same effect on an otherwise normal, healthy woman. In her case, as in the schizophrenics, bonding can be seriously weakened or frayed, for much the same reason. Her child lacks a feeling person to whom he can attach himself. His mother becomes absorbed in her and has no emotional resources left for the baby. Two cases in point, in the form of real-life tragedies, were described several years ago by Dr. Sontag. Because he had been studying both women on an ongoing basis since early in their pregnancies, Dr. Sontag had a unique vantage point. He was able to measure the immediate effect of the tragedy on each unborn, and then after birth, its long-term effects. In one instance, he wrote, a young woman carrying her first baby, which we had been studying weekly, in terms of activity and heart rate, took refuge at our institute one evening because her husband had just suffered a psychotic breakdown and was threatening to kill her. She felt terrified and alone and didn't know where to turn for help. She came to our institute and we gave her a bed and room for the night. When she complained a few minutes later that the kicking of the fetus was so violent as to be painful, we recorded the child's activity level. It was tenfold what it had been in the weekly sessions. Another case came to our attention when a woman we had been studying lost her husband in an automobile accident. Again, the violent activity and frequency of fetal movement increased by a factor of 10. Superficially, these babies' reactions look like those of the children who reacted sympathetically to their mother's distress in Dr. Reinald's study, but the resemblance is misleading. What Dr. Sontag measured was not a sympathetic reaction, but the wholesale terror of a child whose system was being flooded by his mother's anxiety-provoking hormones. The fact that each baby was born underweight and was colicky, cranky, irritable, and cried a lot confirms that each had undergone a serious trauma, since these problems almost invariably are associated with major emotional upheavals in utero. If Dr. Sontag had included more follow-up data on these infants in his report, though, I suspect it would have shown that their post-birth disturbances had less to do with the physical effects of those hormones than with the way the tragedies changed their mother's emotional attitudes toward them. Because what often endangers an unborn child most is not his mother's immediate physical hormonal reaction to an event, but her long-term emotional one. If she becomes so distracted by her own pain and loss that she withdraws into herself, very likely her child will suffer terribly. But if she keeps the channels between herself and the child open and flowing with reassuring messages, he can continue to thrive. As I said earlier, a strong intrauterine bond is a child's ultimate protection against the outside world's dangers and uncertainties, and as we have seen, its effects are not limited to the uterine period. To a large extent, this bond also determines the future of the mother-child relationship. For both, all that comes afterward hinges on what happens now, which is why it is so critical that mother and child remain attuned to each other. This occurs through 3 separate communication channels. With 1 or 2 exceptions, these systems appear to be equally capable of carrying messages from baby to mother or from mother to baby. The first, physiological, is the only one of the 3 that is in a sense inevitable. Even a rejecting mother communicates with her child biologically, if in no other way than to provide him with nutrients. But as we shall see, how mother and child employ this particular route also makes a critical difference. The second avenue, behavioral, is the best understood and easiest to observe of the 3. For instance, hundreds of studies have documented that unborn babies kick when they are uncomfortable, scared, anxious, or confused. Lately, investigators have discovered that a mother communicates behaviorally with her unborn child in certain distinct ways, too. One of the most common of these is by rubbing the stomach. This gesture of reassurance has been found to be nearly universal among pregnant women. The third route, in many ways the hardest to define, I call sympathetic communication. It almost certainly contains elements of the first two, but it is broader and deeper. Love is a good example. How does a 6-month-old fetus know he is loved? Because his mother strokes her stomach, eats sensibly, and acts on his behavioral messages. These are all part of the answer, but not all of it. The crying rate of newborns provides another example of sympathetic communication. Why is it that even very young Chinese babies cry less than American ones? The fact that they do says a great deal about the culture each infant is born into. But how does a 3-week-old, or even a 3-month-old, infant know enough to behave the way his culture expects him to? The answer, I believe, is again sympathetic communication. Yet another example of it can be found in rural areas of Africa, where women carry their newborns, sack-like, on their backs or slung on their sides. Held either way, a baby can easily soil his mother's clothes with his bowel and bladder eliminations. But this almost never happens to an African mother. Somehow she is able to sense his urges in enough time to swing him off her back and hold him away from her before he eliminates. This form of intuitive knowledge is hardly considered unusual. In fact, an African woman soiled by her child after his 7th day of life is loudly and widely branded a poor mother. People in rural societies nearly always are more intuitive than urban dwellers, probably because they are more willing to trust their senses. Rationalization and mechanization of the kind that has spread across Europe and America over the past few centuries seems to destroy that trust. Nature's enigmas make us uncomfortable. If we cannot explain something, we prefer to ignore it. This does not mean that our past or the African present represents a kind of obstetrical utopia. In both, infant mortality rates were and are too high. The ideal would be a blend of the extraordinary maternal sensitivity common in those rural societies and our own high standards of medical care. With bonding, we have already taken one important step in that direction. With intrauterine bonding, we can take the next. More research will be needed, as well as new and more sensitive attitudes. Obstetricians, pediatricians, psychiatrists, nurses, midwives, hospital administrators. Everyone who comes into contact with the pregnant woman can learn to be more supportive, more nurturing, and less ready to apply medical solutions to what are really emotional problems. But ultimately, the success or failure of bonding before birth, like bonding after it, lies with the woman herself. She has to start paying closer attention to the messages she sends her child and those he sends her. That requires knowledge of the routes along which they communicate, and knowledge of the messages that travel along these routes. It also requires a willingness to listen. Her child has a great deal to say, and he should be listened to. Behavioral communication. Child kicking is the unborn's most easily measured form of communication, and any number of things may provoke it, from fear to a well-meaning but noisy father, as audiologist Michelle Clements discovered one day, when the skeptical husband of one of her patients unexpectedly appeared in her laboratory. The man's wife had told him about Dr. Clements' work, but he found it hard to believe that his child could hear. Seeing that her data were not going to convince him, Dr. Clements suggested a practical demonstration. She told him to press his head against his wife's abdomen and yell. What followed was a textbook perfect example of behavioral communication, and also an unambiguous display of fetal temper. As the man yelled, a small volcano of skin suddenly erupted on his wife's abdomen. Highly annoyed, the child had registered his protest at this noisy intrusion with a furious kick to his mother's midsection. Another sound that provokes an emphatic fetal response is the hard, throbbing beat of rock music. As I have said before, unborn children do not like it. One of Dr. Clements' patients discovered this when she was driven from a rock concert by the violent kicking of her baby. Even more distressing to fetal ears are the loud, angry voices of fighting parents. Often this prompts kicking by the unborn. Kicking can also be a sign of fetal distress. A young woman, whom I will call Diane, is convinced that that is what set off the furious kicking of her baby. For the first 7 months of pregnancy, he had been normal for a child of his age. Then, one afternoon in the middle of her 28th week, Diane felt a sharp jab in her abdomen. At first, she dismissed it. She had been out shopping that afternoon and thought all the running around might have tired her child. But by evening, his kicking had grown so intense it was impossible to ignore. Worried, Diane called her obstetrician and made an appointment for the next day. His diagnosis of placenta previa the following morning may have been coincidental, of course, though Diane thinks her child's subsequent behavior makes that unlikely. She is convinced he was kicking to signal his distress because after the diagnosis was made and proper treatment was instituted, he quieted down again and remained calm until birth. Maternal emotions such as anger, anxiety, and fear will also prompt furious kicking. A good example of this are those tragic babies Dr. Sontag described who suffered because of their mother's serious stress. In these instances, what causes the baby to kick is usually a combination of outside and inside events. The mother's anxiety-provoking hormones are flooding his system, making him worried and fearful. Her behavior and her emotions are also affecting him. Almost anything that upsets her also upsets him, and nearly as quickly. New studies show that within a fraction of a second after fear has set his mother's heart racing, his begins pounding at double his normal rate. Mother. Many of the ways a woman communicates behaviorally with her child are so subtle and seemingly ordinary that it is easy to overlook their effect on intrauterine bonding. For example, a large number of couples move into a new home during pregnancy. In one recent study, 79% of the women interviewed said they were planning to change their residences because of the new addition to the family. Of course, it is not moving as such that is the problem, but rather the disruptions and the anxiety that accompany moving. That is the culprit. In a landmark report, Dr. R.L. Cohen showed that the stress triggered by moving to a new area during pregnancy may delay bond formation between mother and child after birth. Fortunately, if the mother knows about such correlations, she can compensate for them by getting extra rest and emotional support, as well as doing some explaining to her baby. Some of Dr. Parza Cohen's other findings were also related to bonding. Another subtle behavioral change that a mother may unwittingly convey to her child is unhappiness about leaving her job during pregnancy. According to one study, as many as 75% of working women either quit their jobs or take a leave of absence during pregnancy. In itself, this is neither good nor bad. Some women prefer to keep working well into their last trimester. Others cannot wait to leave their jobs. Either choice is fine. The danger arises when the sudden loss of financial and psychological independence created by leaving work causes resentment, anger, or dissatisfaction. A child cannot bond with a mother who is seething with anxiety or frustration, no matter how hard he tries. Even the way a woman moves and paces herself throughout the day becomes a form of behavioral communication. Rushing about madly to get chores and errands done, she moves at a different rhythm than when she is out on a long, unhurried stroll, and her child senses the difference. Just as a month or two later, he senses when she is pushing him along in a carriage and when she is bouncing him up and down on her knee. In moderation, such activity is perfectly harmless. The unborn child is remarkably resilient, but it is dangerous to push him to the limits of his endurance through excessive continual stimulation. Sympathetic communication. Child. Dreams are not random or arbitrary events. They happen for a reason, and in the case of a pregnant woman, I think many dreams express her unconscious conflicts about the child. Expectant mothers who have anxiety-ridden dreams tend to have shorter labors and smoother births. Recent evidence indicates that dreams are one of the common and beneficial ways pregnant women deal with their anxieties. I also know there are dozens of documented cases in the medical literature of pregnant women's dreams that have turned into reality. From conversations with colleagues, I suspect that hundreds, perhaps thousands of other such coincidences go unreported because the dreamer or her doctor is afraid of being labeled superstitious or unscientific. These prenatal dreams conform to what we know about the laws of dreaming. There is always an underlying logic to them. No matter how different each dream may be in content, the same patterns and themes appear again and again. The dreamer finds herself confronting her child, almost always in an alarming or urgent situation. The night before one of my patients had a spontaneous abortion, She shouted herself awake several times, yelling, "I want out! Let me out!" She is convinced that was her child speaking through her. A colleague told me about the dream of a patient of his, which, though quite different in every respect, had the same underlying theme: a child trying frantically to convey a message. At the beginning of her third trimester, his patient dreamed she was about to go into labor. Her pregnancy had been uncomplicated physically and emotionally, and nothing in either her medical or psychological history indicated a risk of prematurity. But the dream disturbed her. Convinced that it had a meaning, she began to make preparations for birth, just in case. 2 weeks later, she delivered. At this point, one can only speculate about the mechanisms involved in these prenatal dreams. I believe that they are a kind of extrasensory communication from the child. Lately, this phenomenon has received a good deal of serious scientific attention. At Duke University, a special extrasensory research unit has been studying it for several decades, and the American Association for the Advancement of Science, one of the most august and respected scientific bodies in the world, has been sufficiently impressed with the potential importance of extrasensory forms of communication to sponsor several research projects. It will be interesting to see what sort of results they eventually come up with. Mother. What we know about sympathetic communication from mother to child tends to bear out the theory of extrasensory communication in the young. Nearly every emotion a woman has seems to contain a sympathetic dimension. Even feelings with a clear biological basis, such as fear and anxiety, affect a child in ways that go beyond anything we know about physiology. This is doubly true of emotions that lack any apparent biological anchor, like love or acceptance. Nothing we know about the human body can explain why these feelings affect the unborn child. Yet study after study shows that happy, content women are far more likely to have bright, outgoing infants. A highly complex, subtle emotion, such as ambivalence, provides an even better example. As we have seen, ambivalence can have a harmful effect on an unborn. Yet, there is almost certainly no physiological state connected with it. The emotion is often so muted, the woman herself isn't even aware of it. I think the only logical explanation for these findings is what I have called sympathetic communication. Evidently, the child's emotional radar is so sharp that even the slightest tremors of maternal emotion register with him. In its own grim way, the data on spontaneous abortions and its incidence also tells us a great deal about the nature of sympathetic communication. Taken together, in fact, the studies on ambivalence and coolness and the abortion data provide a good insight into the nature of sympathetically communicated maternal emotions. A significant number of spontaneous abortions occur for no medical reason. The woman is fine physically and perfectly capable of bearing a child. Her problem is emotional, usually fear in one form or another. After studying more than 400 spontaneous abortions, one investigator concluded that fear of responsibility and fear of bearing a defective child materially increased a woman's chances of abortions. In a second study, 2 other researchers arrived at the same conclusion. The only difference was that their subjects had other kinds of fears. They were afraid of being abandoned by their husbands, friends, family, or physicians. Fear, of course, has a biological basis, and it may well be that the neurohormones produced by maternal fear affect the intrauterine environment more powerfully than present research indicates. Even assuming that is true, I doubt any new physiological findings can fully explain the cause of these abortions. Physiological communication. Child. Until recently, it was assumed that the burden of physiologically sustaining pregnancy fell solely on the mother, but new evidence indicates that the child also plays an important role. According to Dr. Liley, for instance, it is the fetus who guarantees the endocrine success of the pregnancy and who triggers many of the physical changes his mother's body must undergo to sustain and nourish him prenatally. So even at this stage, the unborn child may have some control over his well-being, and this fact raises some interesting questions. Specifically, it raises the possibility that the unusually high rates of physical and emotional damage in the offspring of rejecting or unhappy mothers might not be due solely to harmful maternal hormones. It seems at least a possibility that if the fetus does have partial control over a pregnancy and senses himself in a hostile environment, in some instances he may withdraw his physiological support, thereby harming himself. Mother. Anxiety and stress-related hormones are the most obvious form of physiological communication from woman to child. Clearly, those anxieties that touch directly on the child, the pregnancy, the spouse, or the woman's insecurities and inadequacies have the greatest impact on the fetus. But only intense or continued maternal anxiety can be hazardous. The woman who sometimes worries about bills or the weight she is gaining is certainly not putting her child at risk. The amount of hormones such minor concerns produce, if they produce any at all, are not going to affect an unborn child. What he cannot take is a continual assault of anxiety hormones. The danger here is not just to intrauterine bonding either. As we saw in the last chapter, this kind of attack may also set the child's emotional thermostat at a precariously high level. Smoking, excessive drinking, drug taking, and overeating or eating improperly also qualify as forms of maternal physiological communication. Psychologically, as I said before, they represent an indirect expression of anxiety. The harmful changes these substances can produce in the unborn's environment may make him fearful, like smoking and, I suspect, also drinking. But then he has every reason to be worried. Alcohol is a case in point. It can maim, even kill the child. Knowledge of its dangers in pregnancy goes back to the Greeks and Romans, who noticed that mothers who were heavy drinkers bore a much higher rate of deformed and sickly children. Only in the last decade or so have investigators found the scientific reason for this. Alcohol passes through the placenta as effortlessly as nearly everything else a mother eats or drinks. Exactly how it affects her child once it reaches him depends on the amount of alcohol he is exposed to and his stage of development. I think the wisest policy is not to drink at all during pregnancy. If a woman does decide to, however, she should limit her daily consumption to, at the very most, 2 ounces of liquor or its equivalent. Anything above that puts her child in danger of falling victim to fetal alcohol syndrome, a FAS. Investigators still do not understand all the mechanisms involved in this serious disorder, but they are quite sure of one thing. The more a woman drinks, the greater her child's chances of being born mentally retarded, hyperactive, with a heart murmur, or with a facial deformity such as a small head or low-set ears. According to experts at the U.S. National Institute of Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism, 3 or 4 beers or glasses of wine daily can cause 1 or more of these defects, and 6 or more drinks a day can produce the whole horrendous gamut of deformities associated with FAS. A woman who drinks 10 ounces of alcohol daily, or the equivalent of about 6 strong drinks, is playing Russian roulette with her child's life and health. At that level of consumption, his chances of being born seriously deformed are an even 50-50. Almost as critical as how much a woman drinks is when. Those same experts warn that there are 2 periods of pregnancy when drinking is particularly perilous to the child. The first is from the 12th to the 18th week, when his brain is in a critical stage of development. The second is from the 24th to the 36th week. Cigarettes are another major hazard to the unborn. Smoking cuts the supply of oxygen available in the maternal blood, and, without an adequate flow of oxygen, fetal tissue growth may slow. A woman who smokes 1 or 2 cigarettes a day is probably not seriously endangering her child, though, like alcohol, the best policy is abstinence. But the woman who smokes 2 packs a day probably is. According to recent studies, babies born to mothers who smoke 40 or more cigarettes a day are smaller and in poorer physical condition than those of non-smoking mothers. At age 7, children of smoking mothers tend to have more problems learning to read and a higher rate of psychological disorders than other youngsters. There is also growing evidence that a father's smoking may affect fetal development. West German investigators recently discovered that the unborn children of smoking men had a markedly higher rate of prenatal mortality than the babies of non-smoking males. Why this is so is not quite clear, but toxicologist Helmut Griem believes smoking may produce subtle but potentially disastrous changes in male sperm. Reports of the effects of caffeine on the fetus are less persuasive than those of alcohol or cigarettes. The handful of studies that have been done on caffeine in pregnancy have been inconclusive. The one partial exception is a recent report from the University of Washington. Here, investigators found a firm correlation between caffeine, whether in the form of coffee, cola, tea, or cocoa, and certain birth disorders. The highest caffeine consumers in the study had the highest rate of babies with poor muscle tone and low activity levels. Are these effects short-term, or are they harbingers of some serious and permanent health disorder? Dr. Ann Streiskuth, head of the team, says that vital question cannot be answered without further research. Under the circumstances, I think it would be wise for a pregnant woman to switch to decaffeinated coffee and to cut down on cola or cocoa consumption. At the very least, the lack of caffeine will do her good. Caffeine has already been implicated in high blood pressure, and recent evidence indicates it may also be a factor in breast cancer. But if a woman is so dependent on coffee or cigarettes that going without them would produce excessive tension, it is better to try to cut down rather than totally abstain from these substances. The risks of drug taking in pregnancy have been so widely publicized that there is no need to dwell on them. Suffice it to say that the unborn is most vulnerable to their toxic effects early in pregnancy, and that even small amounts of any drug, including common over-the-counter ones such as aspirin, can be harmful to him. It may seem by now that everything a pregnant woman does, from taking a simple aspirin for a headache to having an occasional negative thought or tense moment, is going to affect her relationship with her child. This is not so. The material in this chapter has to be kept in perspective. Occasional negative emotions or stressful events are not going to affect intrauterine bonding adversely. The unborn child is far too resilient to be put off by a few setbacks. The danger arises when he feels shut off from his mother, or when his physical and psychological needs are consistently ignored. His demands are not unreasonable. All he wants is some love and attention, and when he gets them, everything else, including bonding, follows naturally. Chapter 4 is now complete. That's it for today's episode. Stay tuned for the next one. Until then, take care and see you soon. Thank you.